I'm really happy to welcome everybody to this webinar around philanthropy's meaningful middle. I'm Nathaniel Heller from Geneva Global. I'll be our sort of quasi-MC and co-speaker and presenter for this morning alongside Marisa, who I will invite to introduce herself in just a second. But again, thanks to everybody for taking time out of a start of a work week to join us. We're going to try and keep the presenting at you part of this fairly brief. Really hopefully 20, 25 minutes, worst case a half hour, and to open up at least the second half of the time block we have together for a lot of conversation and Q&A as best as one can do over a virtual bridge. So again, thank you for joining. Just a tiny bit about myself, and then I'll hand it over to Marisa to introduce herself. I'm really privileged to work at Geneva Global, which is a philanthropy support and advisory organization that is part of a broader collection of organizations called Global Impact Ventures that works across the spectrum of philanthropy to provide a range of advisory and infrastructure support and services to donors as well as nonprofit organizations that are doing the hard work of social impact around the world. A lot of my day job is working with large private foundations, ultra high net worth families, as well as larger and medium international nonprofits in many different ways, shapes, and forms. And I was privileged to co-author the paper that we'll talk about today with Marisa and her team at Bernstein. Marisa, over to you.
Thanks, Nathaniel. Hi, everybody. Happy Monday. So glad you're here to join us. So I joined Bernstein a few years ago after 20 years in the social sector, and I've worked in organizations that have large philanthropic efforts like the Art Institute of Chicago, built a nonprofit, so really understand sort of the grassroots side of things. And here at Bernstein, I work with our financial advisors and their nonprofit and foundation clients to kind of do what they do with the most efficiency and resources as possible. So I was really excited to work with Nathaniel and team on this paper because I think it's really rare to find great information around everyone who is not a mega donor. We see a lot of that in the news, but what about every other foundation and individual donor who most of us as nonprofit practitioners or teams who support cause-based work, those are who we're working with. So we really we worked to outline some strategies that those donors are using. And as we think about being kind of in the early innings of the wealth transfer, how can we as social sector organizations and those who support them drive more impact and partnership? So thanks for having me today.
Super. So why don't we dive in to what we're going to cover in this first part of the conversation before we open it up to everyone else. We'll talk a little bit about the headlines and highlights of this white paper we co-published this past summer, the meaningful middle of philanthropy. As Marisa said, talk about what both firms have seen work well for some of the more creative and ambitious meaningful middle donors in all kinds of situations and geographies. Why we think, unsurprisingly, this segment of the philanthropy ecosystem is a bit overlooked and actually a bit undervalued in many respects. And then we'd really love to hear from a lot of you in the second half about your own experiences that may align with some of the ideas we share, maybe very different and sort of contradict what we're sharing. But this is a really fluid and interesting space. And as a segue into some of that initial material, as Marisa mentioned, Geneva Global and Bernstein have actually worked together for a number of years on a lot of day-to-day work. And Bernstein is one of our trusted partners for managing a lot of the philanthropic capital that we are privileged to steward as part of our day-to-day work. And a couple of years ago, we were quite literally comparing notes, I think at the Bernstein office in Philadelphia, with a number of leaders on both sides of both organizations, and kind of came to a similar conclusion, which was there was a lot of excitement and kind of froth in the philanthropy ecosystem or sector around, as Marisa alluded to, the mega donors that grab a lot of deserved headlines. And this was at a moment where I think it's fair to say that the Mackenzie Scott giving was at kind of a peak in terms of just the general frenzy. Every nonprofit that we all worked with or startup organization was desperate to ask, how do we knock on that door? How do we access this funding? I keep reading stories about these huge buckets of new funds. And we said, that's great. And there might be a place for that in terms of your fundraising strategies. But actually, there's this huge kind of segment in the middle, which sort of sit between a a Bill and Melinda Gates, a Warren Buffett, a Mackenzie Scott, et cetera, and the kind of mass market donors that a lot of us actually might be in our own personal lives, giving them $100, $500, $1,000 to a local fundraiser, to a religious organization, to your, frankly, kids' school group. And that's where statistically a lot of the action is actually in philanthropy. So we said, why don't we actually put a little bit of analytical heft and muscle behind that and try and raise up what we ended up dubbing this meaningful middle. We kind of had an interesting debate in the early days of crafting the white paper in terms of definitionally how would we describe this segment of the donor market. And as you see, we landed on a very generous range of $1 to $25 million. As you get into the paper, for those that have skimmed it, or if you download it and take a peek later, there's a rationale for why we ended at that floor and that ceiling, which we won't go into here. But it really does, in most ways, situate these donors between, again, a lot of us giving out of our pocketbooks at a kind of everyday donor level, and the true kind of billionaire plus types of ultra high net worth donors and private foundations. And anecdotally, we had a strong sense when we started this work that indeed the headlines, a lot of the media attention, and even the narrative within the philanthropy sector tends to anchor at the extreme ends of the spectrum. And that's not out of malicious intent, but there's very much a pattern of that over the decades, which is to get very, very excited, provide a lot of attention to very successful mass market fundraising efforts, which again are well-deserved, highly effective at pooling large amounts of very small dollar donations, and then the mega donors, which get a lot of attention at the other end of the spectrum. And so we said, let's kind of not just continue to amplify where there already is a lot of attention, but start to raise up this really rich segment in the middle, which again we dubbed the meaningful middle. For us, as we got into some of that analytical work together with our co-conspirators at Bernstein, one of the interesting bits of unpacking not just the definition, but also when we began to compare notes in terms of what both shops had seen work well and less well for those meaningful middle donors, there were a few things that kind of jumped out of us. One is, one of the big constraints for a lot of these donors, even though they're often giving at very significant levels, is that they don't often benefit from the infrastructure and scaffolding essentially that you would see with a huge mega donor, whether that's hundreds of staff surrounding them at a large private foundation, whether it's a well-staffed, robust family office, and sometimes even just the basic kind of giving infrastructure and plumbing in terms of accounts and financial infrastructure from a wealth advisor, an investment manager, or even a bank. Some of this giving is happening in a pretty routine and ongoing basis, just out of people's checkbooks, quite literally, with no staffing, no real strategy, et cetera, et cetera. Nothing's necessarily wrong with that, but one of the themes that we highlight in the first part of this paper is that lack of infrastructure is often a constraint, where meaningful middle donors often have aspirations, to their credit, to move from very reactive, arbitrary giving to something that's more intentional and strategic. But that's pretty tough when you have a day job, you might be owning or running a company or multiple companies, you have family commitments, et cetera, et cetera. And so we spend a while in this paper trying to unpack what are some ways to thread that needle, not advocating that every meaningful middle donor needs to go and spend $10 million a year building a private foundation apparatus around them, but that there are ways to do clever outsourcing techniques, clever ways of leaning on in-kind support to sort of level up. And so you'll see in the first part of this paper, we walk through essentially some tips and tricks and things we have seen work well for meaningful middle donors who have managed to make that transition from, again, purely reactive or random giving, to put it bluntly, to something that hangs together a little bit more. We also don't advocate, I'll add, that every meaningful middle donor needs to go the route of being sort of purely strategy driven. And I think we've all seen a number of examples in philanthropy where you get to a point of over strategizing a giving portfolio and a grant making portfolio, the sort of analysis paralysis that tends to creep in. And this is actually a big problem with larger foundations that are incredibly well staffed, who tend to create habits around almost nonstop re-strategizing every 18, 24, 36, 48 months. And that frankly doesn't necessarily lead to superior outcomes over time. I think there's something interesting to be learned from more successful, meaningful middle donors who seem to get to some really good outcomes without a huge apparatus around them necessarily, and also, frankly, without a 45-page strategy guiding them along the way. And again, I think the extremes of both approaches are probably where we try to collectively steer people away from. But there's something quite interesting in the middle that meaningful middle donors show us in terms of how to get to, again, proactive, intentional giving that hangs together with some coherence and logic without having to spend, $5 million on a strategy thing that you have to hire expert consultants for to do for a multi-year period. And as we mentioned here at the last point, there really isn't a right way to do this, so to speak. But when we started to compare our own notes collectively, where we saw really interesting success was this cobbling together of clever solutions, both in-house and out of house, from meaningful middle donors. And then I'll wrap up here before I turn to Marisa. I think what jumps out at me, and again, there's lots more in the white paper itself, in terms of this dichotomy with very real impact coupled with very little visibility in many cases. A lot of meaningful middle donors do a lot of, and increasingly are doing a lot of giving, unsurprisingly, through donor advised funds. I'm sure Marisa will speak to this. The convenience is really unbeatable. It's such a faster way to get money out the door in many respects to the sometimes headache of creating and maintaining a private foundation. We often, just to preempt, I'm sure, a question we may get. That all said, it's very challenging for those who are fundraising on the nonprofit side of things to just go knock on the door of a DAF provider and say, hey, I'm doing great work. Could you give me a roster of your meaningful middle donors who might be really interested in funding me? I think I speak for Marisa in saying that's a very unlikely conversation to yield a lot of fruit. DAF providers don't have a lot of incentive to open up their Rolodexes. But in terms of a tactic to look for those on the fundraising side of the equation, this is where a lot of the action is financially for meaningful middle donors. So rather than going out and looking for a traditional looking private foundation, not necessarily most, but a whole lot of the actual giving is happening increasingly through DAFs. The other sort of tip and trick that we highlight in the paper, again, for those a little bit more on the fundraising side of this conversation, is where meaningful middle donors really have outsized impact is often in place-based giving. Unsurprisingly, these are often realities because donors build and run successful and may sell successful businesses in a local or regional context. They probably raise their family there and they have a lot of clout and influence in a local community. And that tends to be quite naturally and unsurprisingly where a lot of their giving at least starts, is back in that local community. So starting to, even if you're working, in California and looking for a meaningful middle donor in New York that might be interested in funding the work, it does often help to look at those regional ecosystems to sort of pick up who's sort of a less usual suspect donor, and then trying to make inroads and broach a warm conversation. But that place-based giving is a really powerful spot where we've seen meaningful middle donors achieve some really outsized impact. All right, I'm going to click the next one, Marisa, and hand it to you.
Awesome. Thank you. So I think what we'd hope for today is that what you can take away from this is a set of actionable insights that can help if you're a nonprofit leader or fundraiser and looking for some insights into how these donors are giving. That was really the goal here. We were trying to not only define it, but also come to a place where we could figure out how are fundraisers thinking about the donors in their network or donors they'd like to be in their network, and then how are those donors frankly struggling through some of the things that Nathaniel mentioned, small size, very lean teams, a lack of information in terms of who they can grant to and how they can grant to those organizations, which speaks to this first point. So mega donors are often inaccessible. We know that every time you hear about a Mackenzie Scott gift, it's often a gift that's come anonymously or hasn't been expected. So it's not really something we can project for. So we wanted to, again, put some structure around the meaningful middle donors because they often are local to us as organizations, or place-based giving. As Nathaniel said, that's usually that is their community. And so they're hoping to give and have partnership with the organizations in their networks. So that struggle as being inaccessible is not only a struggle for the fundraising teams, but it's a struggle for them. And that's a struggle because what they end up, or maybe the issue of that as a struggle, is that they end up giving to a smaller set of organizations and or to causes that don't exactly align with what they hope to give. So it's great as a nonprofit team to think about how you can kind of expand your network to become more accessible to the meaningful middle donors. And we'll get into some of those strategies. Local leadership. So meaningful middle donors have deep connections with the communities in which they live and work. So all of you know the individual donors or foundation donors who fit within this meaningful middle subsect in your world are serving on boards locally. They are the organizations that you work with year to year. So it's not that you may not understand how they're working or how you engage with them as a fundraiser, but one couple of the pieces that I'd love to call out, which if you check out the executive summary of this piece on the second page and actually at the very end of the actual paper, there are some strategies that we pulled out that these donors are using. And it's really important because some of them will be obvious to you. There are things like a private foundation. That's a strategy for a family or for a donor. Donor advised funds, that's a strategy. And there's some definitions for those that I'll get into more in depth. But the fact is, those are tools and strategies that they're using, and tools and strategies that if you're a fundraiser or a nonprofit leader who understands them better and can kind of communicate your mission and your goals each year, if you can communicate through those strategies, I think it'll land with a little more strength. And I'll go to the next slide, Nathaniel, before I get into some of those details on the trends. So everyone who is fundraising, or even if you're not, you've heard that we're at the early innings of the wealth transfer. And this 30 trillion, it seems like when we started writing this paper earlier this year, 30 trillion was the typical number. It's actually 80 trillion plus. So really what this is about is the silent generation and the baby boomer generation. They're passing down 80 trillion plus in wealth to their heirs. There's an estimated 12 trillion of that going from those individuals to charitable entities. So over the next 10 years, 12 trillion. But that's just an estimate. The other reality is there's a lot of money coming down from those generations to their heirs. One great stat I love is that roughly 57 of millennials are set to inherit 1 million plus. So there's all of these funds that are coming down and being gifted, and then those millennials will have either a philanthropic strategy for you to access as a meaningful middle donor. How do you talk to those individuals about planned giving and how this money they may not have been expecting or they may not need to sort of spend on operational costs in their life, for example. How can you fit into that as an organization who needs support? So the other, I would say, piece of this new wave of philanthropy is that there is a lot of millennial and below generations. There is a lot of interest and curiosity around how to kind of craft your own philanthropic strategy. And I think the strongest examples of those that we see are when organizations have as much support to give as the donor as they're expecting from the donor in return. So the more strategic you can get about that conversation with those donors, the more interesting it will be, the more it will align with their goals to be, to fulfill their double bottom line approach. And anyone who's familiar with that double bottom line approach, it's what nonprofits do every single day. It's raising funds and running the business and also making an impact. And that's really the way that philanthropists think about their strategy as well. They want to invest their charitable dollars in a way that feels great, and it doesn't necessarily require a lot of reporting, et cetera, that we know that thanks to trust-based philanthropy, we've kind of moved past that place of needing to kind of report robustly on what's going on as a nonprofit organization. But the fact is there's I think an easier sell, a more successful sell, and greater partnerships you can build with donors if they understand what their reciprocal benefit is and how much impact they're making with you. And we'll get a little bit more into the reciprocal benefit, because the outcome of this paper and maybe the greatest value, I think, is, again, these strategies that donors are using, whether it's their relational capital or interest in social enterprise, operating foundations versus DAFs. The more you consider all of those pieces as part of your gift acceptance policy and communicate to donors about them, the more fruitful your conversations will be. Nathaniel, we can go to the next page. So about some of those strategies, just relational capital. And the reason we outline some of these is because as we've been socializing this piece and talking to meaningful middle donors, what we hear pretty regularly are some of the pieces that we've outlined here. So relational capital, I'll use one example recently, a conversation we were having in Nashville. Nathaniel and I were on a panel, and one of the philanthropists who gives substantially every year said that he really wants to kind of be courted before there's a marriage. So it wasn't that he was looking for a lot of high touch conversation or information. It's just that there was a little bit of a lead time and a little understanding that he wanted to get to before he made his decisions on where he was giving. So he serves on boards, he gives his relational capital kind of before he makes the decision to give. But it's important to I guess think about that, not so much in a high touch way, but just in terms of lead time, building in the capacity for your teams to build some relational capital with donors, doing the research to find them, and then courting them before kind of marrying them is a good place to be. Innovation beyond grant making. So the idea here is that there's we have a partner actually that we work with that helps donors find organizations. It's kind of a step beyond going to GuideStar and looking for organizations. And we partner with them. They're called Give Team. We partner with them because we find that donors are really interested, again, back to that double bottom line. They want to find a way to invest in an organization, not just beyond the mission, but in ways that encompass operating support and program support. And so one of the things that we're working on with folks as we talk through this is just what does your case for support look like? If you have a 1 or 2 page document that outlines the impact you're making and some visual plans for the future. So a very dynamic document that helps donors see very clearly what work you're doing. It's a more fruitful conversation. And then the best of both worlds piece, I guess what we want to point out here is that, again, impact investing, not necessarily in the investing world, but the way that charitable dollars are employed to do impact based work, this kind of reciprocal benefit that we're talking about is really important here. One of the resources that we pulled together at the end of the year on the Bernstein team is a set of, it's a customizable email actually that you're all welcome to, but it's for organizations to send out to donors, and it highlights what are the kind of most pressing or timely non-cash giving vehicles that we're seeing donors use based on tax year and what's going on in the markets. We've had strong equity markets this year, so we're expecting that donors will have some liquidity that they want to keep. They want to reduce their taxable load. So this is a really wonderful time to approach donors at year end for planned giving and other non-cash gifts. Letting them know that you're open for business for donor advised funds contributions, or letting them know that you do accept non-traditional assets, appreciated stock, et cetera. And we have some resources and tools around all of that if any of that is interesting to you. So I'll go to the next slide, please. Great.
I think the next one is Q&A.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'll add one quick point, and then we're going to fling it open, I think, for all kinds of conversation. Not to harp on this too much, but this idea of relational capital was really one of the most consistent, I guess, observations or insights both the Geneva Global and Bernstein teams had as we crafted this paper. And it really does tie in, as Marisa was speaking to the place-based nature of where meaningful middle donors can really outperform, frankly, a lot of other donors. And I say that a lot of us, I suspect on this call as well, do a lot with or support or receive a lot of funds from national donors, from international donors who operate all over the US, all over the world in many different respects. It's really hard in many respects for those donors to be very effective at the local and regional level because they just don't have history or credibility in a place, whether it's a city, a county, a region, even a state or a province somewhere. And that's not a criticism, it's just the reality of human nature. And this is where meaningful middle donors, again, as we kind of went through a lot of our experience and triangulated it across both shops, really stand out. These are the folks that can bring together mayors and state legislatures and local civil society and civic organizations because they know the people. Their kids do things together. They may have built businesses together. They've worked together and done deals together. And that is really special and unique. And it's something that's really difficult for, again, because we've been picking on her, a Mackenzie Scott or Bill Gates to do in pick your favorite state, city, or province. Just really tough to pull off. And so I think that to me was, of any of the interesting takeaways that we highlight in this work, that place-based opportunity is one that really stands out to me. I don't know if Marisa, I'm characterizing that correctly or incorrectly, but the more we've done some of these roadshow events together, that's the one that often jumps out.
Yeah, I agree. And we'd love to open it up to Q&A. I think if there's any of we don't have a lot of time together today, so if there's anything we touched on that you want to dig into a little bit deeper, I was just looking at my notes. I talked about donor advised funds, but I didn't give a ton of information there. Just as a quick note, donor advised funds they've doubled in size in terms of assets held nationally in the United States. They've doubled since 2018. So they continue to grow. Every fundraiser knows there are, lots of donor advised funds held at community foundations, but they're also a vehicle that individual philanthropists who may not be holding their funds at community foundations, they're using them as a strategy. And if you're familiar to donor advised funds, they are a donor gives to a fund, they take the charitable deduction in that tax year, and then those funds sit in as long as it takes to spend down the funds for charitable causes. It has to go to charitable organizations. They sit in that fund until they're stewarded by causes. So we get a lot of questions around kind of how to access those. But I think what's interesting is private foundations have a required minimum distribution of 5%. So any foundation in your network is likely giving out 5% of their total corpus that they're holding in investments, whereas donor advised funds on trend actually give out 20% of the total 53 billion that's sitting in assets. So they're actually giving out more than foundations. And it's just, as long as you're talking to any individual donors, whether they're major gift donors, planned giving donors, annual donors, just reminding them that if you have a donor advised fund, we'd love to talk about it and would love to be included in your planning. So just wanted to mention that. But any questions, or Nathaniel, anything you'd add?
Mm-hmm. No, nothing from my end. So yes, why don't we open it up? I think there's at least two ways to kind of literally and figuratively raise your hand. I think everybody should have a raise hand option, in which case we can try and take everyone in order and unmute and invite questions that way. If it's easier or more comfortable to use the webinar chat, please feel free to use that, and we'll do our best to be as equitable as possible in terms of first come, first serve on the questions. So with that, please feel free to jump in.
Okay, looks like we have, what advice do you have for nonprofit leaders seeking to build long-term relationships with meaningful middle donors, especially those who may not have formal philanthropic structures in place? Nathaniel, I don't know if you want to take that and maybe touch on donor collaboratives and things, and then I'll take the question after you.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Yeah, actually, I'll cheat and use your initial answer there. We've at Geneva Global, we've done a lot of work over the decades helping to incubate and support a variety of types of what are sometimes called donor collaboratives or pooled funds. And unsurprisingly, for those that are less familiar, these are efforts where multiple donors come together around a particular issue or cause, pool philanthropic capital, and try and do sort of joined up grant making and or other social impact support out of that aggregate pool of funds. And the thesis behind it is essentially that 1 + 1 = 3. If we bring together, I'm just making up numbers, 10 donors who each have $5 million to give away, you can sometimes do a lot more with $50 million in terms of the kinds of initiatives and programming you can support than you could with 10 $5 million individual grant making portfolios. This is a really kind of, I think, interesting place for many meaningful middle donors. There are examples, although probably not enough, of meaningful middle donors coming together amongst themselves at that level, often in a place-based way, to do this sort of pooled giving, and we talk about this in the paper, where there's an interesting set of barriers. And I think this is something to answer the question where those seeking the funding can help to do some educating and sort of thought partnership with meaningful middle donors, is actually finding ways to break down the culture barriers between meaningful middle donors and, quote, professional elite mega donors. Collaboratives and pooled funds are a fairly increasingly familiar technique and habit for a lot of those mega donors, but there is a real cultural barrier that often intimidates meaningful middle donors. They feel like they aren't, quote, professional philanthropists. They may not speak the right vernacular or vocabulary. they don't have a staff around them, or if they do, it's one or two people, not 200. And those are actually quite challenging to overcome, at least in the short term, even though in many cases, meaningful middle donors are able and willing to give at the same or even greater levels as the quote professional philanthropists at the more mega donor end of the spectrum in terms of what they could actually put into a pooled fund or donor collaborative. And we've seen fairly few examples, not zero, but fairly few examples of that interesting mixed approach where you have a certain number of meaningful middle donors partnering up with the more kind of professionally staffed large or mega donors. And I think that's an interesting place to explore, again, for those who are trying to build relationships with meaningful middle donors. One of the huge appeals of collaboratives and pooled funds is not just the 1 + 1 = 3 effect, but it's also an incredibly rich ecosystem in which donors can learn about a sector, about a topical area, about how other donors behave and make decisions. And so that learning agenda can be really appealing to meaningful middle donors. So to sum that up, I think there's an interesting conversation to potentially be had for nonprofit leaders to say to meaningful middle donors, hey, of course, we'd love to solicit your support for our work, but also can we think creatively about bringing together a pool or a small community of donors who think in a like-minded way and seeing if we can make some of that that happen. And we can help you with that and help you think through how to overcome some of those barriers.
Yeah,
Thanks
and I
for
would
that
add to that.
question.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I would add to that just some tactical items. So, part of this discussion is not about, the meaningful middle donors are out there. It's about non-traditional giving is a whole new category for your kind of stewardship list. So you may know of the same 10 donors that you've already been working with in the past, but have you approached them on your availability to accept donor advised funds? Have you talked to them about planned giving? We know that planned giving is a legacy plan. So bequests are 90% of all planned giving revenue. So that's kind of the biggest return on investment. But that the point there is that every annual donor and every major gifts donor has a legacy plan, and 69% of donors who add, let me restate this, only 25% of donors who add a charitable entity, a nonprofit organization into their will, only 25% of them change it. So the average, meaning if you can get into someone's will early, the average age of writing a donor's will is 44. So if you can get in early, you're likely to stay there. And so it's really these strategies around what other types of giving should we be presenting to donors, foundations, even community foundations, so they know that you're out there. One note on community foundations. I think there's always a varying response about how involved or I don't know, difficult to engage with community foundations can be in some communities. Regardless of that, I think it's really important because they're a hub of, donors park their donor advised funds there. Getting your information, this is a brand awareness opportunity, reminding community foundations that you're open for business and there are different types of programs and initiatives and operational costs that donors can invest in. It's just, I think, a good refresher and reminder for them. So I would say talking to your existing donors and or new donors, reminding them you're open for planned giving, specifically bequests and donor advised funds, talking to community foundations, and then giving circles, I should have started with that, excuse me. Nathaniel was talking about collaboratives. The giving circles are kind of more of a small version of that on a place-based level. So if you would like to talk to new donors, going and presenting to giving circles, where it's typically 30 plus professionals who gather together and choose an organization to give to each year, reminding them that you're there because it's not just that one gift that could come from that giving circle. You're now exposed to all the donors who are parts of it. We have another.
Great stuff. We have 2 or 3 queued up, including one in the Q&A window, which I didn't know existed. So I'll try and keep an eye on the many different chat windows. So Casey was asking, yeah, it's a good question about a return on investment in terms of which requires more effort to cultivate meaningful middle donors or small mass market donors. There's a lot of people on this call I know who I know professionally who have a lot of experience with mass market fundraising. I'll answer this really quickly and then turn to Marisa. This is not empirical, but just kind of anecdotal experience. One of the truisms with large volume, small donation efforts is there is a real upfront cost And often the curve sort of looks like this in terms of return on investment. So you have to spend money at the outset to cultivate, multiple thousands of small market donors in all kinds of ways that would be familiar to folks, digital advertising, fundraisers, goes, et cetera. And eventually, if you do it well and stick to it, it does pay for itself and you get actual ROI from that. But it's very difficult to not go into a modest deficit initially with those campaigns or efforts if you're starting from scratch. I think that is different for meaningful middle donors, where it doesn't require quite the amount of upfront cost apart from time and opportunity costs, which are of course real. So I think in the early stages there is a difference. Where it flips a little bit to me is that the cost of stewarding those relationships, at least in terms of time and sweat equity, does diverge over time. Generally, a successful mass market effort is not going to have lots of us who are raising money on the phone for hours each quarter, talking to those donors. We're not going to be having lunch with them every month, et cetera, et cetera. That might be fairly different for a meaningful middle donor who's giving you $50,000, $100,000, $1 million, $5 million. It will require real stewardship. That does take time and is frankly fairly appropriate, but that is a bit of a difference. So my rambling answer to that question is that the effort that's required evolves over time as we go through sort of a life cycle with those different donor segments, and those answers differ depending on probably on the timeline. Marisa, does that sync up with your all's collective experience at Bernstein?
Yeah, I would say the only addition to that would be it's kind of a volume issue. So if you have a substantial amount of small donors or annual fund donations, but and that's really supporting what you do, I think that's a great return on investment. But I think in general, what we're seeing is these, because of the wealth transfer, because of financial advisors working closely with donors and more increasingly, even kind of meaningful middle donors, they're looking for strategies and opening up their doors to giving more substantially. So I think both would be great, but I would say one of the trends that we have seen is an AI trend. This is an example that Save the Children uses. They using their own CRM, it had an AI plugin. They identified through engagement statistics, they identified and converted almost 350 donors from their annual campaign donors, so they're smaller donors each year. Through engagement stats, they were able to identify these 350 and convert them to larger donors. So they probably identified more than 350, but successfully converted 350 donors. So maybe the question here is just to kind of mine your existing base and start to think through, who do we have that is a smaller donor, but maybe they've been shuttling away their savings and could be a bequest donor in the future. So I think just kind of going deeper into your list was where we would start.
Yep. All right, a couple more in the main chat window. Hi, Ryan. Ryan has a good question. We touched on a bit. Maybe Marisa, this is partly maybe for you first, since you offer DAFs. We don't. Yeah, how do nonprofits, if at all, get on DAF provider radars? And this is again a very common question we've gotten repeatedly over many events.
Yeah, and we are digging into this, and I would say I personally am interested in this because Bernstein has a DAF through National Philanthropic Trust. So we hold roughly, I think, 900 DAFs. And they are, in essence, often anonymous. Donors are at the time of closing out their tax year or earlier. They have a liquidity event. They have philanthropic interests, but they're not sure where to give. So the strategy is to park these funds in a donor advised fund. So kind of as a practice, Bernstein and other DAF holders hold these names confidentially. So there's not really a list out there. That's why I mentioned community foundations as one tactic. The other tactic would be, and by that I just mean pulling together some brief materials, asking your community foundation if you can come in and present, and or just sending them to them as a reminder, hey, here's what's changed for us. Like maybe we haven't been on your list for a while, but here's maybe why we should when donors consider investing in local causes. Make sure we're on your radar. But the other thing I would do is start with your gift acceptance policy. Make sure donor advised funds are something you and your board are already accepting, because there is kind of a process for how they are acknowledged. It really is best practice to acknowledge both the fiscal sponsor of the donor advised fund, whether it's a community foundation or other. A note goes to them, but it's best practice if you can get their name to send one to them as well. So kind of adding that into your gift acceptance policy, but then making it very clear on your donation website, which we see very rarely, I can't tell you how many times I go after a meeting and I've met an organization, I go to their website to look at their Donate Now page, and there's nothing there about donor advised funds. And that's specific because there are certain plugins. It's a tech thing you can add to your website that says, here's how you give from directly from your donor advised fund to us. So I would look into that. Just Google how can we accept donor advised funds, or how can we, what button can we add to our website? Just starting there. That way, any donor advised fund holders out there, you're showing up on their list as an organization that they can give to. And then final thing I would note is that anytime you're having a conversation with an individual donor, just make sure that they know that, just ask them, do you have a donor advised fund? We'd love to talk to you about giving to it. Because sometimes they're like, I don't know who to give to. This is the point of us doing this paper, is they don't necessarily have or can find a list of organizations to give to. They really, it may be obvious to those of us who've worked in the sector kind of where to dig this information up, but they don't have it. So just reminding them that you are accepting DAFs would be great.
Yeah, and I'll add two really quick things before we take the next one. I think Marisa's spot on, that organizations often undervalue the importance of making it easier for meaningful middle donors, or frankly anyone with the DAF, to give to them. The plugin thing is actually quite real, and I've seen that a number of times. It's actually for especially less sophisticated donors who aren't super savvy about even how to contact their own DAF provider, and that frankly is a common experience. It can be a little bit intimidating and paralyzing when they have to start to figure out, do I need your 990? Do I need like a IRS letter? Do I send that to my DAF? So the easier and lower friction you can make it. I mean, a plugin is a very easy thing with DAF Pay or some of these plugins where it's, it pulls up a login, you put in your credentials, and you can donate in a couple of clicks. That's really beautiful. If that's not possible, at least having literally a single sheet of paper PDF that has all the details that a DAF provider is going to need, who I am, what my EIN is as the organization, or if I'm fiscally sponsored, who my fiscal sponsor is, and what that EIN is, what the wiring instructions are to send the money, all that just teed up in a really pretty PDF that you can send over. It seems really trivial, but it actually can be really helpful for not inadvertently providing an excuse for the intent to get gummed up in the annoying mechanics. A lot of these app providers, again, Marisa, you could speak to it more directly, do not have a fleet of staff sitting, like there's not hundreds of people just sitting around. It might be 3 people or 6 stewarding thousands of DAF accounts potentially. And they're all smart folks, but they're also not experts in any sector, or at least, not every sector. So the more you can make it plug and play, turnkey, the better, because there's a high volume of these requests coming at even the largest providers like a Fidelity or a Schwab or a Vanguard, and they aren't going to have the time to troubleshoot if you forget to give them, again, an account number or the Swift code or whatever. So the cleaner and tighter that is, and on a single sheet of paper and or plug-in, the better, just to move that excuse off the table, essentially.
Yeah, and I'm glad you said that, Nathaniel, because maybe it would be helpful just to illuminate what a DAF team looks like. I'll use Bernstein as an example. We have 2 people on our team, and 900 DAF holders. But there's 2 people on our team. This isn't exactly their job. They're doing other things. And so in the same way that you as a fundraiser have a book of the donors who are giving to you, there are 900 donors giving to this staff. And so there's a lot of, I would say, focus on the donor and focus on the DAF accounts and the administrative questions that come up and the tax questions that come up. So it's quite a heavy lift for either a community foundation or an organization like ours. The shortcut for you might be to think of these professional partners as sort of like centers of influence for you. So having financial advisors in your network and reminding those financial advisors, hey, if you have any donors who are thinking about giving, just wanted you to have our materials. Same with attorneys, tax attorneys, who are often working on not just the wills and or the updating to estates that they're doing for their donors. They're also making charitable recommendations because their donors are looking for it. So just expand your network of quote unquote donors to the professional partners who serve them, and that might go a long way.
Yep, that's great. I appreciate that color. It is quite interesting. I think there's a lot of misconception out there that there are, again, hundreds of staff sitting around, and it's often not the case, even at the biggest ones. Okay, next question. A really insightful one from Michelle around donor collaboratives, and I'll just paraphrase, is it sometimes the responsibility of the nonprofit to pull together the donor collaborative? And I was kind of speaking to that issue earlier in the conversation. My quick answer is, and this might sound a little bit lazy, it depends. We have seen collaboratives work really well and have a lot of long-term success because they were indeed the vision of the implementing nonprofit at the center, or maybe a collection of nonprofits and sort of social impact doers. Other times, collaboratives are the brainchilds, children, sorry, of a number of donors who come together initially. And there frankly are some pretty obvious pros and cons to either. They can both work and they can both fail. It really depends on getting the mix of incentives right. I think it's fair to say it's tough for donor collaboratives to really thrive and reach critical mass at some point without at least a small number of key donors kind of raising their hands and saying, yeah, we're going to be a part of this, because it gets really challenging to attract donors if they don't see that there's some other skin in the game from some other donors, either quite literally that these others are already in the common pool, or that they've said, yeah, if we can get 5 others, then we'll put in this amount of money. At the same time, collaboratives that are entirely birthed by just donors without much design or consultation with implementing partners often run the risk of a lot of donor-driven initiatives, which is they tend to exhibit some blind spots early on and kind of forever. And this, again, speaking candidly, is one of the challenges that a lot of donors with good intent have, is a bias that, we know what the world needs, we know how to fix it, we just need to pool capital together, do a bunch of regranting, and we're going to generate a lot of success in the world. If that's done in a bubble or a vacuum without some pretty meaningful and deep consultation with those who are ostensibly going to be putting those dollars to work in the world, it often leads to a lot of frustration and tears downstream. So I think in a perfect world scenario, regardless of literally who had the idea first for the fund, whether it's a nonprofit / implementing partner or an initial donor or two, there needs to be some genuine co-creation pretty early on. And that's where we see a lot of success, where you have a couple nonprofits, a couple of donors start to come together, get excited about the idea, figure out how they're going to recruit other partners and co-donors to the pool, and off and running we go. That's where it gets really special, and you can actually get to that 1 + 1 = 3 sort of dynamic long term. But again, the extreme versions of that, where it's either all donors and no social impact partners thinking they know what needs to be done in the world, or frankly, where it's just all nonprofits kind of trying to just find a clever way to squeeze some more money out of donors and then try to dress it up as a pooled fund, that often doesn't work as well. So I think partnership is kind of the buzzword there that tends to work well. And again, what's less crucial to me personally, again, just speaking personally, is, who had the initial bright idea. It might be a nonprofit, might be a donor, but it's those next conversations that often matter much more, which is bringing in those second, third, and fourth partners to really get the ball rolling.
Yeah, and I would add a little bit to that, just that if you're curious around the difference between donor collaboratives and giving circles, you can obviously Google it, but there's Charity Navigator has a list of maybe the more accessible giving circles, and they're thematic. So based on the missions they're interested, or the types of causes, or even specific cultures that they invest in. So Charity Navigator is a good resource. And then one other resource I would mention for all these types of different funders are philanthropic consultants. And a lot of times organizations are hiring, donors are hiring them, foundations are hiring them just to help them refine their giving strategies. So I might, if I were fundraising right now, I might put together a letter that speaks to all of these things, all of these different kind of categories that we mentioned, whether it's financial advisors, attorneys, philanthropic consultants, main point of contacts for the giving circles or collaboratives, and send them some information about how you can help them. Here are the ways that we can help you match your donors' philanthropic interests with ours. A couple examples, easy way to get a hold of you, just 1 page. And so it's a really wonderful, helpful way for those who are trying to do the work of connecting the meaningful middle to you, help them do their job.
Yeah, and I'll add one more quick comment on this topic, and completely agree with Marisa's tips there. Back to what makes it sometimes a little bit challenging for meaningful middle donors to jump into these ambitious pooled funds or donor collaboratives. there's a lot of mechanics around what makes again, I'm sure a lot of people on this call can affirm this from their own direct experience. There's a lot of mechanics that are required to make a successful pooled fund or collaborative. And there's some of these are fairly big decisions. For example, okay, even if we find, back to my 10 donors with $5 million each, where are we going to put that $50 million? There's actually a bunch of options. We could put it actually in a DAF. We could call Marisa, put in a DAF at Bernstein, and then advise Bernstein on how to do the regranting. That would get us up and running within a week, right? Or 2 weeks, let's say. We could give it to a trusted nonprofit organization that might be a grantee. Maybe we tell them, no, you don't get to benefit from the funds, but we'll give you a little bit of a kind of a cut off top, and you're going to do the regranting for us because we trust you. That's a common approach with, again, pros and cons. Thirdly, we could call up a fiscal sponsor and say, hey, fiscal sponsor, we want to put our $50 million here. And then we'll create a sort of advisory committee that's not legally official, but unofficially is the thing that makes the decisions around how to regrant this. All of those are pretty important decisions, neither better or worse, but they come with significant advantages and trade-offs. And it can feel pretty intimidating fairly quickly to some meaningful middle donors who don't have a lot of experience doing that. If this is their first rodeo, their first pooled fund, sort of flooding them with all these choices, what do you think? DAF, nonprofit, fiscal sponsor, and maybe there's a fourth or fifth choice for the plumbing. You get a lot of deer in the headlights reaction at times. So there's a bit of an educational experiential journey that's required to sort of gently accompany meaningful middle donors into some of these more sophisticated approaches. And again, back to Michelle's good question, I think that is where nonprofits who have seen this before, done it before, benefited from these approaches before, can help to educate in a very gentle, constructive way to say, look, don't freak out. This is all possible. Here's the pros and cons. And here's a way to make your own decision as a donor as you come into this, but it is possible. It doesn't require a PhD or anything special. Couple minutes left for any other questions. And again, I'll keep an eye on at least 3 different windows here to see what pops in.
Or even anything that's working really well on this topic. If you are engaging with meaningful middle donors and something's just been a great strategy, I'm sure others would love to hear it. So please feel free to share.
While we're waiting, I'm thinking back, Marisa, to last week in Nashville when we did this in person. We haven't talked a lot today about the evolution in the quote industry towards trust-based giving, but we do. I'm just thinking of another theme that we haven't talked about that's in the paper. We really, I think, are collectively excited about how naturally a lot of meaningful middle donors come to trust-based giving without coaching or training or even advice from smart people like the team at Bernstein or Geneva Global. It's a very interesting pattern to observe that it's meaningful middle donors who get it often quite intuitively and would kind of say to you, why would I do it any other way? Of course I'm going to give unrestricted. Of course I'm not going to earmark my dollars. Of course I'm going to give multi-year support. So there's some sort of powerful inspiration to draw from in terms of that segment of the market that's probably been ahead of a lot of professional donors in quotes. And that the rest of the professional industry has been catching up.
I absolutely agree. And Michelle has one more question, and I'll touch on that in 1 second, Michelle. But I want to just agree with you, Nathaniel, and say one of that same philanthropist we were talking to in Nashville said that trust goes both ways. He's very generous and is very hands off when he knows that his dollars are being used in the way that they were agreed to be used. And beyond that, he trusts the team. He knows that he's not looking for a lot of reporting. As I think a lot of philanthropists say these days, we don't read it, we don't want it. They just want a baseline understanding of, I would say, the efficiency of spending the funds. And beyond that, they're open to just how you want to use them. Michelle, to your point, you said, just to paraphrase it, that some middle-sized donors they have portals for you to submit a concept. Is it better to try to get a call or find a way in through the relationship? A recent example of this, I was working with a family. They sold a business. They are now they're upgrading their grant making from the 50 million they were giving out to substantially more. So they are very philanthropic. They have worked with us now to try to streamline some of the ways that they do their grant making. One of the things that they're doing is, just to your point, opening up a portal on their website so that you can submit requests. They're doing that from their perspective just to kind of streamline the request. It's easier for them to put it into their system. The system then summarizes the request, and it makes it easier during their family board meeting to make some of the decisions around that. So I absolutely agree. You should start with that step. If a donor has gone to those lengths to set up a system, they're pretty sophisticated and they're trying to do what they do better and with more efficacy for organizations like you. But I don't think it hurts to follow up if you're not getting a response. But if you do get a response and they've decided maybe it's not the right fit, I don't think it's too much to ask for you to ask for some feedback on why. Maybe it was just the way that you were talking through your programs, or maybe it's just not right, fully aligned with their mission. But I would definitely go through their desired step first, just to kind of respect the process.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I'm smiling. We've set up very similar portals and ledgers for meaningful middle donors as part of our day-to-day work. And yeah, half the time it's a way to start to keep track of things, because otherwise, again, in the absence of a huge apparatus or staff, a lot of these donors are getting, dozens of requests in one way, shape, or form per week. Friends, family, random nonprofits, everybody under the sun who frankly knows they have wealth, is seeking access to that wealth for one reason or another, whether it's an investment opportunity, philanthropic giving, et cetera. And it's pretty overwhelming. And at some point, you actually literally lose track when the volume gets to a certain level. And so part of it is just purely keeping track of who's asked me for money, who have I answered, and just knowing that. Part of it also is to set up a bit of a screen to try and minimize, quite literally text messages and phone calls coming to people's cell phones, and trying to create a bit of a mechanistic intermediary to just make the personal life a little bit more manageable. Final point, what we tell a lot of nonprofits we work with when we're helping with revenue diversification efforts is, as Marisa alluded to, we know statistically that warm introductions matter a heck of a lot for success when it comes to fundraising. It's a truism. And so, yes, I would agree. Submitting something respects the process, but if there's any way to get a genuine, non-creepy, warm introduction or referral to that donor from someone they trust or know, and it's not going to feel completely overeager, that's really, really valuable and important. So it's ideally good to play both in parallel and
Yeah, and Michelle, I think back to the courting idea, if you're submitting something and not hearing back, if you're submitting something and hearing back, then I think just going along with the process for a minute and making your warm introduction when it's good. If you're submitting something and not hearing back, following up immediately and trying to build that relationship is a great place to start.
Yeah. And I think we are 30 seconds from time. So seeing no other questions, thank you, Cecilia. Let me just say thank you. I'll turn to Marisa to say thanks as well. Huge appreciation for joining us this morning. Again, that link to the actual paper is at the top of the chat window. Yes, I see my colleagues saying we've recorded and we'll send this out so you can listen to it as often as it's helpful, but please feel free to share with colleagues and friends too. Marisa, over to you for the final word.
Yeah, well, good luck, everybody. Year-end fundraising is upon us. And if there's anything you need from Nathaniel or I, please feel free to reach out individually. This is a real passion for me, and I have a lot of appreciation, a great appreciation for the hard work that you do. That double bottom line of doing the work and building revenue diversification around it is a lot. So thank you so much for coming today.